I had washed pots in that palace for 9 years before anyone there learned my name, and I want to be honest with you from the start. That suited me fine. There is a particular peace in being unseen. I had come to the world of Sethar on a labor barge with 200 other Earth folk, signed onto a 10-year kitchen contract because my husband was 3 years in the ground by then, and the house we'd shared felt like a coat that no longer fit. I was 51. My hands were already a map of every hot pan and lye bath and paring knife of my life. The Sethari took us because we worked cheap and complained little, and they set us in the lowest kitchens of the high house of Kelvin, beneath the floors where the tall, pale lords walked, and there I scrubbed. You should understand what the Sethari are, because if you have never stood next to one you will not believe me. They are beautiful the way a hard frost on a window is beautiful, pale, silver-haired, their skin the faint lavender of the sky just after the sun has gone. Their eyes hold a low light of their own, like the last coal in a banked fire, and when they are moved that light brightens, and when they are cold it dims to almost nothing. They are taller than us, and they move without hurry, and they have a way of looking through a human servant as though we were a draft from an open door, something they feel and dismiss in the same breath. They had 1,000 years of court and protocol and silver-threaded manners, and not one line of it had ever been written with a creature like me in mind. So I was a draft. I knew it. I scrubbed the great copper vats and the stone troughs. I scoured the roasting pans the size of bathtubs. I scraped the burnt sugar off the confectioner's molds, and at the end of a shift my arms ached in a way that I had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. The work had a rhythm to it. Lie and rinse, scrub and rasp, the brush going back and forth, the slosh of the water, the steam rising off the troughs and fogging the little high windows where, if you tilted your head, you could just see a strip of the violet Sethar sky. And I hummed, I always hummed. My mother had hummed it over her washtub when I was a girl, in a kitchen so small you could touch both walls with your arms out. It was nothing, a low tune, 3 notes that walked downhill and 1 that climbed back, a work song with no real words, the kind a woman hums to keep her hands moving when her mind is somewhere else. There might have been words to it once before her mother, but by the time it came down to me it was only a shape in the air, a homely little rise and fall that fit the rasp of a brush the way a hand fits a worn handle. I never decided to hum it. It came out of me the way warmth comes off skin. I'd be elbow-deep in a trough of gray water, scouring, and I'd hear it under my breath and only then know I was doing it. The other earth folk teased me gentle about it. The young ones anyway, the boys who hauled the meat, the girls who plucked the long-necked birds the lords ate at festival. There's Marin, singing to the pots again, they'd say, and I'd flick water at them and tell them the pots were better company than they were, and they'd laugh and we'd go on. The Sethari overseers never said a word about it. I doubt they heard it. I doubt they heard us at all. That was my whole world for 9 years. The vats, the troughs, the steam, the tune. I tell you this so you'll know I was not anyone. I had no learning. I had never touched a healer's instrument or read a line of the empire's law or stood within 100 paces of the people who ruled it. I was a widow with red, cracked hands and a work song, and I had made my peace with that, and I expected nothing more from my last years than warm dishwater and the company of my own kind. Then the heir was born, and the whole palace began to come apart. We heard about it in the kitchens, the way we heard about everything late and sideways, from the understewards who came down for the lord's meals and lingered to gossip. The young Empress Lysen had borne a son. There was joy at first, real joy. The kitchens were ordered to make the festival breads, and for 3 days we baked until the oven scorched our faces, and the smell of honey and char and sweet seed oil rose up through every floor of Vailrith. The whole great palace seemed to glow. I remember thinking, scrubbing the honey pans at midnight, that even a stone heart would have softened at it. A child, the oldest good news there is. And then the baking stopped, and the talk changed, and the air in the palace changed with it. The air would not be quiet. That was all anyone could say at first. The little prince cried. Not the ordinary crying of a newborn that comes in waves and passes. This was a crying that did not stop. Day and night, the understewards said, their light dimmed with worry, the boy wailed. He took the milk. He was warm, he was whole. The healers swore there was nothing torn or broken or fevered in him. But he screamed as though something unbearable were pressing on him from every side, and no one in the high house of Kelving could make it cease. You have to understand what that meant to them. The scullery are a proud people, and they are a learned one. Their healers are the finest in 100 worlds. They had stitched the Empress's own grandfather back from a wound that should have killed him, regrown a minister's hand, eased the dying so gently that death looked like sleep. They had a name and a remedy for every ill of the body and most of the mind. And here was a child, the only heir, the whole future of the high house, and not one of all their gathered wisdom could quiet him. They tried everything. We heard it all in pieces over the troughs. The physician royal himself, a scullery so old his light had gone the color of moonstone, sat with the child for 2 days and could find nothing. The healers brewed soothing draughts from the silver flowers that grew only in the high gardens, and the child took them and wailed on. They changed his nurses, and they had nurses, a dozen of them, the gentlest and most practiced women of the noble houses, and each one held him and rocked him and sang the old scullery cradle airs, those long shimmering melodies that I had heard drift down sometimes through the floors, and the child screamed through every one. They brought a music master with his crystal chimes. They brought a mystic from the old observatory who burned herbs and read the boy's birth stars. They brought, at last, the minister of the household, a tall, cold man named Verrill whose light I never once saw brighten, and he stood over the cradle and ordered the child to be quiet, as though a newborn could be commanded like a guardsman, and of course the child wept all the harder. And the Empress did not sleep. That part came to me later, but I'll tell it now, so you understand her. Lysen was young, younger than my own daughter, who I'd left grown and married back on earth, and she had lost her own mother to the long sickness only the year before, and now she had a son who screamed and would not be comforted, and an empire of cold, pale faces telling her, with their dimming lights and their careful words, that they did not know why and could not help. She held him herself, hour on hour, until the nurses had to take him from her arms so she would not fall. She wept where no one could see her, which is to say where everyone saw her, because there is no privacy at the top of a tower like that. They say her light grew so faint in those days that the courtiers began to murmur the word they should not have murmured, the word that meant a failing, a fatting, a house that might not hold. All of that was happening 11 floors above my troughs. To me it was steam and rumor. I scrubbed. I hummed. I was sorry for the young Empress the way you are sorry for a stranger in a story, a clean, distant sorrow that costs you nothing. I did not think it had anything to do with me. Why would I? I was a draft from an open door. It was the 8th day of the crying when they sent me up. It happened because of the hearth, you see, and because no one else would go. The royal nursery had a great old stone hearth in it, a ceremonial thing more than a useful one, and over the 8 days of healers and herbs and burnt star readings it had filled with soot and ash and the gray residue of a dozen mystic fires until it was a black ruin. The nursery staff were noble scullery. They would no more scrub a hearth than they would fly. And the household servants who might have done it had grown afraid of that floor, afraid of the screaming, afraid of the Empress's failing light, afraid in the way people are when something is wrong that no one can name, and they want to be anywhere but near it. So the order came down through 3 understewards and landed, the way the worst orders always do, on the lowest worker who could not refuse. The hearth in the high nursery, the kitchen overseer told me, not even looking at me the way they never looked at me. Scrub it, tonight while the household sleeps, speak to no one, be gone before the dawn watch. I took my brush and my bucket and my block of gray lye soap, and I went up. I had never been so high in that palace. The servant stairs went up and up, narrow and worn, past floors I had only ever heard named, and with every floor the air got cleaner and stranger, smelling of silver flour and cold stone instead of grease and steam. At the top, the stair led out into a corridor so beautiful it stopped me, a floor of pale veined marble lit by a soft blue light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, tall narrow windows looking out on the night sky of Sethar, where two small moons hung like droplets. I stood there a moment with my bucket, an old woman in a wet apron, feeling like a smudge of soot somebody had tracked into a cathedral. And then I heard the crying. It came from down the corridor, through a doorway hung with a curtain of that crystal thread the Sethari love. I have heard Bobbies cry all my life, my own, my grandchildren over the long link from earth, the dozen children of the kitchen folk. This was different. This was a small voice gone hoarse from 8 days of use, ragged at the edges, rising and falling without rest, and there was something in it that went straight past my ears and took hold of my chest, the way the smell of your own childhood kitchen can stop you dead in a strange city. It was not just a baby crying. It was a baby crying who had given up on being answered. I should have kept to my task. I want you to know I meant to. The hearth was at the far end of the nursery, away from the cradle, and the order had been to scrub it and speak to no one. There was a great curtained alcove where the cradle stood, and I kept my eyes from it, and I set my bucket by the hearth and knelt down and got to work, and I told myself the screaming was none of my business. But you cannot work in your hands while your hands are full of someone else's grief. So I did the only thing I knew. I scrubbed, and I let the rhythm take me, lie and rinse, scrub and rasp, the brush going back and forth on the black stone, and somewhere in the second or third minute, without deciding to, I began to hum. Just my mother's tune, 3 notes downhill and 1 back up, low under my breath in time with the brush. I wasn't thinking of the child. I wasn't thinking of anything. I was a tired woman cleaning a dirty hearth in the middle of the night, doing the thing my hands had done 10,000 times, and the work song came out of me the way it always did, because the work was there and the song lived in the work. I scrubbed and hummed for a good while, before I understood that the crying had stopped. I went still. The brush stopped on the stone. The corridor was silent, the great nursery was silent, and into that silence my own held breath sounded loud as a bellows. I thought with a cold drop in my stomach that the child had simply cried himself out, that he dropped into the exhausted sleep of the truly worn, and that it had nothing to do with me. I waited. I did not move. After a long moment, very softly, the crying began again, but thin now, uncertain, a question more than a wail. And here is the thing I cannot fully explain even now. I started humming again, not to fix anything. I think I only meant to fill the awful waiting with something other than that small lost sound. I picked the tune up where I'd left it, low and even, and I went back to scrubbing because my hands didn't know what else to do, and within a breath, within a single phrase of that downhill and back up, the crying stopped a second time. And this time I knew. I knew the way you know the sun has come out behind you, because the back of your neck goes warm. I should have left. Every sensible bone in my body told me to leave the hearth half done and creep back down the servant stairs and never say a word to anyone. I was a kitchen scrub maid who had no business near the heir of the high house, and I had just done the one thing the entire learned weight of the empire had failed to do, and there is no faster way to ruin in a place like that than to make the great ones look small. I knew it. I gathered my bucket. But the tune had stopped when I stopped moving, and the crying had crept back, that thin, frightened question, and I could not, I am not made so I could not, walk down the stairs and leave a baby crying like that with the whole tune still warm in my throat. So I went to the cradle. I want to be careful here because of what came after. I did not snatch him up. I did not even mean to touch him. I came around the crystal curtain, and there he was, the heir of Kelvin, the future of an empire, and he was just a baby. A tiny pale lavender thing, his fine silver down of hair stuck to his forehead with the sweat of 8 days' grief, his little ears coming to their soft Sethari points, his eyes screwed shut and streaming a light so faint it was barely there, his whole small body rigid and shaking with the effort of crying that had long since stopped making sense to him. He had cried himself past pain into something worse, a kind of lonely habit, the crying of a soul who has called and decided no one is coming. I have raised children. My hands knew what to do before my head had any say in it. I leaned over the cradle and I kept the tune going, low and warm, and I laid one of my red, cracked old hands flat and gentle on his shaking little chest, just the weight of it just to say, "Here, I am here, you are not calling into the dark." And I hummed. 3 notes downhill, 1 back up. The brush rhythm, the washed-up rhythm, my mother's rhythm, the oldest plain human thing I had. He turned his head toward me. Those faint-lit eyes opened, swimming and unfocused, found the shape of me leaning over him, and I will remember this until I die. The little light in them steadied, brightened even by the smallest degree. The shaking eased. The crying stuttered, caught, came apart into hiccups, and then into long shuddering breaths, and then into nothing at all, and the little prince of the high house of Kelvin lay in his cradle under the weight of one human hand, and looked up at a soot-smudged old kitchen woman humming a washed-up tune, and he was quiet. I picked him up. There was nothing else to do. He reached in that boneless way Bobbies have, and I am not the kind to leave a reaching baby unheld. He was lighter than he should have been after 8 days. I tucked him against my shoulder where my own had gone and my daughter's after, and I rocked side to side from the hips the way your body simply knows, and I hummed into his fine silver hair, and within a minute his head went heavy and his small fist uncurled against my collarbone, and he slept. He slept. For the first time in 8 days, the heir of the empire slept, and he did it drooling on the apron of a woman whose name no one in that palace knew. I stood in the middle of the great nursery in the soft blue light, rocking and humming, and I felt the strangest thing come over me, not pride. I want to be clear, there was no pride in it. It was closer to sorrow. I thought, all this beauty, all these silver-haired lords with their 1,000 years, and not one of them ever just held him and hummed. I thought of the Empress, the girl younger than my daughter, weeping where everyone could see. I thought somebody should go and tell her she can sleep. That was when I heard the gasp behind me, and the cold voice, and I understood that the 8 quiet days I just bought the empire were about to cost me dearly. The chief nurse had come in, a tall Sethari noblewoman named Quen, the highest of the heir's keepers, who had not slept much more than her Empress. She stood at the curtain with her hand at her throat and her light flaring up bright and then dropping to almost nothing, and the look on her beautiful pale face was not gratitude. It was horror, and I understood it even then. She had spent 8 days, she and all her noble training, failing to do the one thing she existed to do, and she had walked in to find a human pot scrubber doing it without effort, with the child she had failed to quiet asleep on a servant's filthy shoulder. There is a kind of person who in that moment feels relief, and there is a kind who feels only the shame of it and reaches for someone to blame. Lady Quen, may the stars forgive her, she was tired and frightened and proud, and she reached. "Put him down," she said very low. "Put him down and step away from the cradle. How dare you? How dare you lay your hands on?" I put him down, gently, so gently, easing him into the cradle with the tune still going under my breath so he wouldn't wake, and the moment my warmth left him his face crumpled, and his little light dimmed and the crying began again, weaker but climbing. Lady Quen went to him and lifted him and rocked him in her practiced noble arms and sang the shimmering Sethari cradle air, and the child wailed and would not be comforted, exactly as before. I should have run. The understeward had said, "Speak to no one, be gone before the dawn watch," and I had broken every part of that order, and now the chief nurse was calling for the guard. 2 of them came, pale and tall in their silver mail, and they took me by the arms. Not roughly, the Sethari are rarely rough, but the way you'd take hold of a thing that had gotten somewhere it shouldn't be. Lady Quen was saying words I half heard, intrusion and the sleeping household and a kitchen human, touching the heir's person, and her light flared and dropped, and over it all the baby screamed. And I stood there with my wet apron and my bucket forgotten by the half-scrubbed hearth, and I thought, very clearly and calmly, the way you think when a thing has already gone past saving. They are going to send me down the stairs and off the world, and that baby is going to cry until something in him breaks. It was the second thought that hurt, not my own fate. I'd had a long life and a fair one. It was the baby. I had felt the moment his light steadied under my hand, the moment he decided someone had come, and I could not stand the thought of him learning all over again that no one had. So I did the second foolish thing of that night, which turned out to be the only wise thing I ever did in that palace. I stopped fighting the guard's hands, and I planted my feet, and over the screaming and over Lady Quen's cold, flaring voice, I began to hum, loud enough to be heard. My mother's work song, 3 notes downhill and 1 back up, the washed-up tune, steady and plain and unhurried, sung by a tired old woman held between 2 soldiers in a room full of people who thought she was nothing. And the baby stopped crying. The whole room stopped with him. Lady Quen went silent mid-word. The 2 guards' hands loosened on my arms. The child, in the chief nurse's noble arms, turned his small head toward the sound of my humming the way a flower turns, and his light steadied, and his screaming fell away into those long shuddering breaths, and the nursery filled up with a silence so sudden and so complete that I could hear the soft blue light humming in the walls. Into that silence from the curtained doorway a voice said, "Do that again." I had never seen the Empress. I knew her at once. She stood in the doorway in a sleeping robe of pale layered cloth, no crown, no jewels, her silver hair loose, and tangled from a bed she clearly had not been sleeping in, and she was younger and smaller and more worn than any picture of an empress I had ever carried in my head. Her light was the faintest I had seen on any living scullery, a guttering thing, nearly out. But her eyes were fixed on me, and on the child gone quiet in Lady Quen's arms, and there was something in her face that I knew across every difference of world and blood, because I had worn it myself the night they told me my husband would not last till morning. It was the face of a person at the very end of what they can bear, who has just seen, against all hope, a door open. "Your radiance," Lady Quen began. This human intruded, she has no place near the heir, I was about to have her." "Do that again," the Empress said. She did not raise her voice. She did not even look at the chief nurse. She was looking at me. "Please." That please undid me more than any command could have. An empress asking. I have turned it over many times since, that one small word, and I think it was the truest measure of her, that even fallen to the floor of her grief, with her son screaming for 8 days and her house murmuring its terrible murmur, she said please to a kitchen woman held between 2 guards. I looked at her, and I looked at the guards, who looked at the Empress and let go of my arms, and I crossed the room slowly, so as not to startle the child, and I held out my old red hands. Lady Quen's light flickered furiously, but the Empress made the smallest motion, and the chief nurse, stiff as a frozen branch, laid the heir of Kelvin into my arms. He settled against me at once, that little body going soft, the fist coming up to my collarbone. And I rocked from the hips, and I laid the flat of my hand on his back, and I hummed the work song low into his silver hair, and the future of the empire fell asleep on my shoulder in front of his mother and his nurse and his guards and his great cold palace, as easy as any baby has ever fallen asleep on any tired woman since the start of the world. The Empress made a sound. I had thought her past tears, but she made a small broken sound and put her hand to her mouth, and her light, I watched it happen, her light came up. Not all at once. Like a coal you've blown on, a slow warming from the center out, until her face was lit again from within the way the scullery are meant to be lit, and the tears on her cheeks caught that light and shone. She came across the room on bare feet and stood very close, looking down at her sleeping son on a servant's shoulder, and she did not reach to take him. She just looked. And then she looked at me, really looked, the first member of that whole shining people in 9 years to look at me and not through me, and she whispered, "What is it? What did you do? The physician royal could not, the healers, the music master. What magic is this?" "No magic, your radiance," I said. My voice came out rough. I hadn't spoken aloud in hours. "It's a work song. My mother used to hum it over the wash. It's nothing. It hasn't even got words." It quieted my son, she said, when all the learning of calving could not. I know, I said, because there was no use pretending otherwise, and then because I am an old woman and too tired by then to be careful, I said the thing I'd thought standing in the middle of the nursery. He wasn't sick, your radiance. Begging your pardon. I don't think there was ever anything wrong with his body. He'd just been crying so long he'd stopped believing anyone would come. A baby calls and calls, and if it's answered enough he learns the world will answer. And if it's not, if every time he's lifted by careful, clever hands that are frightened of him, that are doing a duty and not a, I stopped. I had gone much too far. I am a scrub maid lecturing an empress on her own grief in her own nursery. I looked at the floor. Forgive me. I've no business saying such things. The empress was quiet for a long moment. When I dared look up, her lit eyes were on her son's sleeping face. No, she said softly. Go on. He's not frightened of you, I said. You're his mother, he knows the smell of you. But you've been frightened for him 8 days, and a baby feels that the way they feel a draft. Everyone who picked him up was afraid he was sick, afraid he'd die, afraid of what it'd mean. And he felt every frightened pair of hands, and it told him the thing he was already afraid of, that something was wrong and no one could fix it. I shifted the warm weight of him on my shoulder. My hands aren't afraid of him, your radiance, that's the whole of it. I've held 100 bobbies and buried none of them, and I've no idea who he is. To my hands he's just a tired baby who needed holding by somebody who wasn't scared. That and an old tune with a rhythm in it. Bobby's like a rhythm. It tells them the world keeps going. That's all I did. There's no magic in me. I'm only a woman who isn't afraid of your son. I have said many things in my life and forgotten most of them. I have never forgotten the silence after that one, in the blue-lit nursery, with the 2 moons in the window and the air of an empire asleep on my apron. The Empress reached out at last, not for the child, but for my hand, my free hand, my cracked red kitchen hand with the lye burns and the knife scars and 9 years of gray dishwater ground into the knuckles. She took it in both of hers, which were cool and smooth and pale as the inside of a shell, and she held it and she said, "What is your name?" 9 years. 9 years in that palace, and the first of all of them to ask me that was the Empress herself, at the worst hour of her life, holding the hand that had quieted her son. "Marin," I said, "Marin Holt, your radiance." "Marin Holt," she said, as if she were learning a word in a language she would need for the rest of her life. "I will not forget it." She did not forget it. None of them ever forgot it again. What happened after the nursery happened fast, the way these things do once the great ones decide. By dawn I was not on the servant stair. I was in a warm room with a window, and there was food I had not cooked, and one of the noble nurses, not Lady Quen, a gentler younger one named Sale, was sent to sit with me and ask with careful courtesy whether I would teach her the tune. I tried. Bless her, she had a voice like falling water, trained on the shimmering cradle airs, and she could sing my 3 notes downhill and back true as a bell. But the child cried for her all the same. It was never the tune, you see. The tune was just the door. What came through it was the thing I had told the Empress and could not teach, hands that weren't afraid. You cannot train that into a frightened person in a morning. It comes from a long life and a certain kind of tiredness and the simple animal fact of having held the dying and the newborn both and learned that you survive it. The young nurse wept when the baby would not take to her, and I held her hand too because she was barely more than a child herself, and I told her it would come to her in time, when she'd lived enough to stop being afraid. I hope it did. There was a reckoning over Lady Quen behind closed doors that I was glad not to see. She had called the guard on the woman who saved the heir, in a colder court that ends badly. But the Empress, whatever else grief had done to her, had come out of it with mercy. Lady Quen kept her post and her honor, and she never once thanked me, and I never once expected her to, and we got on for years afterward in the careful frozen way of 2 women who both know exactly what passed between them and have agreed never to speak of it. That suited me. I have never needed an enemy to grovel. I only needed her to stop being one, and she did. And there was the matter of my reward, which I will tell you about because it is the part everyone always wants to know, and because it is the part that mattered least to me and most to them. They offered me everything. I do not say that to boast. I say it because it is the simple truth, and because the offering of it told me more about that palace than 9 years of scrubbing had. The minister of the household, the cold tall man named Verrill whose light I had never seen brighten, came to my warm new room with a face like a man swallowing a stone, and he made me an offer in the formal old Sethari way. A title, a real one, a place among the lesser nobility of Kelving, a house in the high gardens, a chest of the silver thread cloth and another of jewels, gold enough that I could have bought back the whole street I grew up on and the next 3 over. The Empire's gratitude, he called it, in a voice that made clear he thought the Empire was being very generous to a thing like me. I have thought a great deal about why I said no. I want to be honest and tell you it was not pure goodness. Part of it was that I am old and set in my ways, and a chest of jewels is no use to a woman whose pleasures are warm dishwater and a strip of sky. Part of it was that I had seen, in 9 years of scrubbing beneath them, exactly what the high gardens and the titles did to people. How the light went thin and careful in the ones who lived up there. How they learned to look through their own kind the way they'd always looked through me. I did not want to become a person who looked through anyone. And part of it, I'll confess, was a small hard satisfaction in watching Minister Verrill's face as I declined the Empire's generosity, since he had so plainly braced himself to bestow it. But the true reason was simpler, and I gave it to the Empress, not the minister, when she came to ask me herself why I would not take what was offered. I don't want the gardens, your radiance, I said. I don't want a title, I wouldn't know how to be it and I'm too old to learn, and jewels won't warm me at night any better than my own blanket. I looked at her, and at the cradle where the boy slept easy now with the gentle young nurse Sale learning slowly how to be unafraid beside him. But I'll tell you what I'd take if you're offering. I'd take a place beside him, not above anyone, not a lady. Just let me be the one whose job it is to hold him when he can't be held. Let me keep my brush if I want it. Let me keep my own name. And when he's grown enough not to need an old woman's tune, let me go back to my pots if I miss them. That's all. Let me stay near the boy. The Empress was quiet, and then her light came up the way it had that first night, warm from the center out, and she said, "You would rather be his keeper than a lady of my court." "I'd rather be useful than honored, your radiance," I said. "I've been honored for one night now, and I find it tiring. But I held that boy and he slept, and that's a thing worth getting up for. There's not many at my age. I'd like to keep it." So that is how it was settled, and how it stayed for the rest of my years on Sethar. I did not become a lady. I became, in the plain word the kitchen folk used among themselves, and that I liked far better than any title, the prince's holder, the human woman who held the air of Kelvin when no one else could, who hummed him to sleep on the bad nights, who taught a frightened young nurse how to stop being frightened, and who could be found on her free afternoons, down in the lower kitchens with her sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a copper vat she had no need to scrub, humming her mother's worksong over the gray water because her hands missed the rhythm of it, and the steam reminded her of home. The boy grew. He grew straight and bright and far too quick, the way they all do. He called me by a Sethari word that has no good earth translation. It is what they call a person who is family by choosing and not by blood, and it is a high word, higher than they knew they were giving it to a scrub maid. And the first time he toddled across the nursery and put his small lavender arms around my knee and said it, his light shining up at me, every cold, careful face in that room went still, and I had to turn to the window and pretend it was the steam in my eyes, except there was no steam. Only the violet sky and the 2 small moons, and an old woman undone by a baby's word. I tell you all this so you'll understand what I learned in that high palace, after 9 years of being a draft from an open door. They had everything, the Sethari, 1,000 years of learning, healers who could regrow a hand and ease a death into sleep, Music masters and mystics and ministers, the finest of 100 worlds, gathered in the most beautiful house I ever stood in. And not one of all of it could quiet a frightened baby, because the one thing none of them had was the plainest thing there is, a pair of hands that weren't afraid, and an old tune with a rhythm in it, and the simple unlearned knowledge that when a small thing calls in the dark you go, and you stay, and you let it know that the world will answer. I had that. I'd had it all along, scrubbing the troughs they never saw me scrub, humming the song they never heard me hum. It was never magic and it was never grand. It was only the oldest human thing, the thing my mother gave me over a washtub in a kitchen so small you could touch both walls, that you keep your hands moving and your heart steady, and you answer when you're called, no matter who's calling or how far down the table you sit. The Empire never did learn the words to my mother's song. There weren't any to learn, but every child born to the high house of Kelvin after that one was held, the first thing, by hands that were taught not to be afraid, and hummed 2 and 3 notes downhill and 1 back up, and they called it, in their court records, by a long Sethari name that means the holder's heir, as though it were an ancient and noble thing. I never corrected them. Let them think it noble. I know what it is. It's a tired woman's washed-up tune, carried farther than my mother ever dreamed, doing the only thing it was ever any good for. Answering the ones who call in the dark. They saw me in the end. The whole shining lot of them, who had looked through me for 9 years, learned my name and my song and my old red hands and looked at me at last. And I'll tell you the strangest part, the part I'd never have believed scrubbing those troughs. It was never being seen that I'd been missing. I'd made my peace with the dark long before. It was being needed, being the one who answered, that I hadn't known I was hungry for, until a baby reached for me in a blue-lit room and a young Empress said please, and an old woman found in her last years on a world that wasn't hers, the thing she'd given up expecting. A reason to keep her hands moving. A small one to hum to. And somebody, finally, who came when she called, because she had spent her whole long life being the one who came when others did.